Welcome to Nazarene, Israel. My name is Norman Willis, and I'm the apostle for the restoration of the original first century faith. And sometimes we get questions from Catholics as to why we call ourselves the original first century faith when Catholicism also claims to be the original first century faith. So we have no desire or wish to offend anyone. So what we thought we would do in this short video is we thought we would present some of the writings from Scripture and also from the works of the Catholic Church Fathers and also contemporary Catholic scholars, which show and demonstrate why Nazarene Israel is the original first century faith and why the Catholic faith and all, if you think about it, all faiths that derive from the Catholic faith cannot be the original first century faith. So this is not intended to offend, but if you are practicing Catholicism or anything that derives from Catholicism, this should help to explain why or what is the difference between the original first century faith. So let's go first to Acts chapter 24 and verse 5. And this is where the Jews have come down from Judea, and they're accusing the apostle Paul or Shaul in front of the Roman governorship. And they're saying, "For we have found this man to be a plague, a creator of dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes." And that's in Hebrew, that's the Min HaNetzarim. Now, notice what's being said here is that the apostle Shaul is being accused of being a sect of the Nazarenes, but this is still a part of the nation of Israel, just like the sect of the Pharisees and the sect of the Sadducees. This is simply the sect of the Nazarenes, but is still at this point considered to be a Jewish or rather an Israelite sect. Now let's notice what the apostle Paul or Shaul says about his faith. We drop down to Acts chapter 24 and verse 14. So Shaul says, "But this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect," or the King James Version reads as a heresy, he says, "So I worship the Elohim, or the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law," or the Torah, "and in the prophets." Now that's something the Catholics, and in fact most Christians, can't honestly say. Most Christians specifically do not believe all things that are written in the Torah, or in the law, and in the prophets. But this is something that Nazarene Israel believes in. We believe that we are supposed to imitate the apostle Paul or Shaul like he also imitated the Messiah. So we know the Messiah lived and died as a Jew, as an Israelite. We also know that he kept the Father's law, the Torah, perfectly. We saw how the apostle Paul or Shaul said that he still believed all things that were written in the law and in the prophets. And if we go to passages such as Jude verse 3, we read, "Beloved, while I was very diligent to write to you concerning our common salvation, yet I found it necessary to write to you, exhorting you to contend earnestly for the faith which was once for all delivered to the saints." So we know it was the original first century Nazarene Israelite faith that was delivered to Shaul, also to Jude, and Jude walked with Yeshua. And Jude tells us that this is the faith that Yeshua walked. This is the faith that we also are supposed to be walking. So let's contrast this Nazarene understanding now with the understanding of some of the writers of the Catholic Church. So let's take a look at some of the works of Bishop Epiphanius of Salamis. Epiphanius was the Bishop of Salamis in the 4th century. He's one of the founders of the Catholic Church, or one of the Catholic Church Fathers, and he wrote a very important, very influential work in the 4th century called the Panarion. It translates to medicine chest, meaning medicines to use against heresies, and so that's why it's translated as against heresies. But Epiphanius wrote about some 80 sects that he believed to be heretical, which from the standpoint of the Roman Catholic Church meant that they should be then persecuted or exterminated or wiped out. So it's very interesting. Epiphanius is going to write about this original first century sect of the Nazarenes to which the apostle Shaul says he belonged, as if it was a heresy. So now notice what he says. He says, the Nazarenes do not differ in any essential thing from them, meaning from the rest of Jewry, from the rest of Judaism, since they practice the customs and doctrines prescribed by Jewish law, what's called the Torah or the Torah Moshe. He says, except that they believe in Christ. So in other words, they look Jewish, and from a Catholic point of view, they can't tell them apart, except that the Nazarenes believe in the Messiah. So they're practicing a very Jewish Christian faith in the 4th century. They're doing as Jude said. They're contending for the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints. Epiphanius continues. He says, the Nazarenes believe in the resurrection of the dead, so there's some similarities, and that the universe was created by God. They preach that God is one, and that Jesus Christ is his son. But yeah, he says there's some differences. He says they're very learned in the Hebrew language, and they read the law, meaning the law of Moses, and this last verse may actually be a reference to the synagogue service, whereas in a Christian church, you have a Christian church service. In a synagogue, they have a synagogue service, and part of that service is called the reading of the law. So he continues. He says, therefore the Nazarenes differ from what he calls the true Christians, meaning the Catholics in his terms, because they fulfill until now, meaning in the 4th century, in Epiphanius' day, such Jewish rites as the circumcision, Sabbath, and others. So from a Nazarene Israelite perspective, there was another sect. The sect of the Nazarenes continued to exist until the 4th century, when Epiphanius labeled them heretical, and it was then that the Catholic Church began persecuting and exterminating all other sects apart from the Catholics. So this was the beginning of the end for the Nazarenes, then to be restored in the modern day. It's also very important that Protestant scholarship has since walked back the Catholic Church on some of their earlier claims. Notice that Epiphanius was essentially claiming that the Nazarene sect was heretical, that it had always been heretical, basically because the old Catholic assumption was that the Sabbath, the festivals, the law, and the prophets, those were all out the window or out the door at the time of Yeshua's sacrifice. But the Catholic Church has since been forced to recant that claim, and they've had to modify their stance and explain things in certain ways. So let's take a look now at the works of the late Professor Marcel Simon. Marcel Simon lived in the 20th century, and he was a Catholic expert on the 1st century assembly from the Catholic point of view. And he wrote a book from the Catholic point of view called Judeo-Christianism, or Judeo-Christianity. And let's see what he writes. He says, the Nazarenes well represent, even though Epiphanius is energetically refusing to admit it. In other words, Epiphanius knows this. He says, but the Nazarenes well represent, even though Epiphanius knows this, the very direct descendants of that primitive 1st century community. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Matthew, Andrew, Philip, and the rest, of which our author Epiphanius knows that it was designated by the Jews by the same name of Nazarenes. So what he's saying here is he's saying Epiphanius knows that the original 1st century faith was the Nazarenes. And he even knows that it's it's directly descended from the apostles in the 1st century. He says, he also writes, he says, they're characterized essentially by their tenacious attachment to Jewish observances. So both Marcel Simon and Epiphanius agree that the Nazarenes are still identifying as Jews and they're keeping Jewish rites and rituals. But then he says something very important. He says, if the Nazarenes became heretics in the eyes of the Mother Church, it's simply because they remain fixed on outmoded positions. So what Marcel Simon is saying is that although it was proper and correct for the Nazarenes to practice the faith once delivered to the saints in the 1st century, it was no longer correct to keep the faith once delivered to the saints in the 4th century. In the 4th century, keeping the faith once delivered to the saints, that'll get you killed. Now, by the time of the 4th century, there were no longer outmoded positions. Now there were new positions, the new positions of the Catholic Church. We're going to explore these a little as we go along. But we want to bring up one very important question, and that is, because as a child I was taught that the apostles practiced a Jewish form of Christianity. But the question is, did the apostles practice Jewish Christianity, or did they in fact practice Christian Judaism, or rather Nazarene Israel? Because if you think about it, if we have Jewish Christianity, that's basically a flavor of Christianity. So you can have a Jewish type of Christianity, a Jewish flavor. You can also have a Roman flavor of Christianity. And that's what's basically happening here, is the Roman flavor is saying the Jewish flavor is no good. But you can also have a Greek Orthodox flavor, a Russian Orthodox flavor, a Coptic flavor. If you lived in Babylon, you could have a Babylonian flavor of Christianity. All these many variations are possible. Whereas if you had a Christian form of Judaism, not to split hairs, but if we had a Christian form of Judaism or Nazarene Israel, then there's going to be a continuation. It's going to be an Israelite faith. And they're not going to have an issue with the law and the prophets, just as the Apostle Shaul said. We also need to understand that, well, let's take a look at the words of the Apostle Shaul in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 1, where he says, imitate me, just as I also imitate Messiah. So the Apostle Shaul was imitating the Messiah, who kept the law perfectly. He was trying his best to keep the law perfectly. Jude tells us that this is the faith we're supposed to continue to practice. That's the nature of Judaism, is to look to the founders of the faith and to practice as they practice. This is reflected in passages such as 1 John chapter 2 and verse 6, if we know what we're reading, where John says that if we're abiding in the vine, it says, he who says he abides in him ought himself also to walk just as he walked. And if you're Jewish, it's said sometimes that when a Jew reads the renewed covenant, he gets a lot more out of it than the Gentile does, because he understands that this phrase to walk, even as the Messiah walked, that's a reference to what's called the halakha in Hebrew, or the way you should walk. In other words, you should imitate your leader, just as Shaul imitates our leader. So what did our leader do? What were his customs and traditions? These are the things that Jews would ask themselves. So we see in Luke chapter 4 and verse 16, it says, so Yeshua came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. So a person raised in Judaism is going to look at that, and we have to remember that the writers of the renewed covenant were Jews. So they're going to say, what were the customs and traditions of our rabbi? Let me practice those. That's how a Jew would look at this passage. And that's also what the Apostle Shaul did. We see in Acts chapter 17, starting in verse 1, it says, now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And then we'll continue on to verse 2. And it says, then Shaul, as his custom was, went into them, and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures. So once again, we only have one rabbi in Nazarene Israel, but we need to understand that the Nazarene Israelite faith was a product of the first century. It was a product of what's called Second Temple period Judaism. So let's also see what the Messiah did. He kept his father's commandment as a good son obeys his father in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 8, where he's commanded, remember the Sabbath day to keep it set apart or holy. And we know again that Yeshua was attempting to keep the law as best as he could because he's attempting to please his father. Verses such as Deuteronomy chapter 12 and verse 32, whatever I command you, be careful to observe it. You shall not add to it, nor take away from it. So this is what the Catholic Church does to the Torah, is they change things. They add to and take away from. But what is the need for changing of the days of worship? Why is this done? And is there anything we can see in prophecy that tells us, that speaks of a group of people that would attempt to change the festival times. Well, if we go to Daniel chapter 7 and verse 25, we're told of a character called the little horn. And Daniel 7 and verse 25 says, "He shall speak pompous words against the Most High. He shall persecute the saints of the Most High." And some people believe this has to do with the extermination of the Nazarenes after Epiphanius wrote his book. He says, "And shall intend to change the festival times and the law." And that's exactly what the Catholic Church did. It says, "Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time." So we'll talk more about the time, times, and half a time, and how the Catholic Church changed the appointed festival times in later portions of this video series. But let's look at a few more contemporary Catholic authors. So this is Professor John Law, the late Professor John Law, in his writings in A Course in Religion for Catholic High Schools and Academies. He says, and he's speaking about Epiphanius and others who believed like him here. He says, "Some theologians have held that God likewise directly determined the Sunday as the day of worship in the new law, and that he himself has explicitly substituted the Sunday for the Sabbath." And I know I was taught that as a child in the Protestant church. He says, "But this theory is now entirely abandoned." Again, because Protestant scholarship forced the Catholic Church to change its position on this. And we'll talk more about this in later sections of this video. John Locke continues. He says, "It is now commonly held that God simply gave his church the power to set aside whatever day or days she would deem suitable as holy days." In other words, she can do whatever she wants. The church chose Sunday, the first day of the week, as opposed to the Sabbath being the culmination of the week, the last day of the week. Says, "And in the course of time, added other days as holy days." So in other words, they purposefully and intentionally changed the appointed times and the law. So did they have any scriptural authority for doing this apart from Daniel chapter 7 and verse 25? Let's read the works of the late James Cardinal Gibbons in his work, The Faith of Our Fathers. He almost boasts about it. He says, "But you may read the Bible from Genesis to Revelation." And notice he's quoting both the Old and the Renewed Covenant here. He's saying you can even read in the Renewed Covenant, but you may read the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, and you will not find a single line authorizing the sanctification of Sunday. He says the scriptures enforce the religious observance of Saturday or the Sabbath, a day which we, meaning the church, never sanctify. So this is basically an admission that the Catholic Church has made these changes on their own authority, not on scriptural authority. They're boasting about it even. In fact, this even shows up in the late Stephen Keenan's Doctrinal Catechism. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Catechism, it's basically a series of rhetorical questions and answers, drilling the people in how to answer difficult questions and difficult theories. So the rhetorical question is, have you any other way of proving that the church has power to institute festivals of precept? In other words, he's saying, do you have any proof that the church has the authority to change the appointed times and the law? And the rhetorical answer is, had she not such power, in other words, obviously she has this power, because if she had not such power, she could not have done that in which all modern religionists agree with her. And I'm thinking, no, they do not all agree with her. But it says, she could not have substituted the observance of Sunday, the first day of the week, for the observance of Saturday, the seventh day, a change for which there is no scriptural authority. So this is basically an admission that they are attempting to change the appointed times and the law under their own authority, matching Daniel 7 and verse 25 and not Acts chapter 24 and Jude 3 and other passages. So if you'd like to know more, or if you'd prefer a written version of this study, I encourage you to go to the NazareneIsrael.org website. and download a PDF copy of Nazarene Israel, the original faith of the apostles. We have it in English, Spanish, or German, or you can also purchase a paperback copy at our cost on Amazon.com. I'd also like to invite you, please, to join us again for part 2 of this video series, where we talk about why Yeshua would be called a Nazarene. Shalom.